And good afternoon, everyone. Charles Moscowitz here. Thanks for joining me. And I am joined by Lord Monckton, the Viscount of Brenchley, emanating from the United Kingdom. Christopher, thanks for joining me this afternoon.
It's a pleasure to emanate in your direction.
Christopher, I want to ask you, just for starters, a little bit about a story coming out of Great Britain with regard to the Labour Party head who's taken over from Jeremy Corbyn, who's making a lot of waves in the establishment, we might say. A big story in the Drudge Report today about him. They have one of those kind of very authoritarian-looking pictures of him on the cover. You know, looks like Stalin, you know, with the lighting and the chiseled, features. And it's give us a little bit of the scoop of what's going on there.
Well, now, Keir Starmer is quite rare in the Labour Party because he isn't actually a communist, as Jeremy Corbyn was, for instance.
Yeah.
He is very far to the left. He's not far off being communist. He's also much cleverer than Jeremy Corbyn. He has considerable forensic skill, which means that at the dispatch box, when he faces Boris Johnson, who is lazy and ill-prepared but eloquent, he tends to win the exchanges because Boris isn't always so well briefed. I think that will change. I think Boris's team were slow off the mark in realizing they were no longer dealing with Jeremy Corbyn, who was more or less completely incompetent. And Keir Starmer, who is a lawyer, is very, very far from incompetent. He has considerable forensic skill, much the same thing as Margaret Thatcher had. And he wields the scalpel in a very crafty, almost invisible way, so that Boris doesn't see the heffalump trap coming until he's thundered straight into it. So Keir Starmer has been tending on the whole to win certainly the earliest of the parliamentary question sessions, which now only happen for weeks as to protect prime ministers from effective leaders of the opposition. But the more recent signs in Parliament are that Boris's team are getting their act together. They're briefing Boris a bit more competently, so that when Keir Starmer comes up with his cleverly researched questions, Boris is beginning to be able to answer them back. So I think it's going to prove a much more even match than it would have been if Jeremy Corbyn had stayed as leader, because Boris is probably one of the 3 or 4 most eloquent MPs in the chamber.
Oh, he's very good.
And also, he speaks the language of ordinary folk. This is the thing that Margaret Thatcher used to do terribly well. He can speak over the heads of the cloying, largely communist establishment, direct into the hearts and minds of the people in a way that nobody else can in the Tory party at the moment. So Keir Starmer, who is a little bit robotic, can't really match that. So what he's doing is playing to his strengths and using his forensic ability of doing the research, finding out what Boris said 6 months ago and throwing it back at him now. That kind of thing he's very good at. So he's doing that. And Boris is now, like it or not, even though Boris is not, like as Churchill was, a man who could both do the rhetoric and understand the detail. Boris is a little bit too lazy to really get down and dirty among the detail, particularly since this episode of Chinese virus that he had, which very, very nearly killed him.
And and I want to ask you about that, if I may. Sometimes elections take on a bigger aspect than simply the personalities of the people involved. They have a greater social impact on what's going on in a society, how people are feeling. And for that reason, I think right now the big polls in the United States show that Joe Biden is actually beating Trump by 11 points. It's very frightening. But the fact is, it doesn't matter whether Joe Biden is somebody who's virtually incoherent, cannot even string a sentence together, looks ridiculous sitting in his basement with geese, bellowing out the window trying to do an interview. And the fact that he's obviously very corrupt. His son is being brought in for questioning about the Burisma deal. He's got a grandson named Burisma Biden, for God's sakes. He's got connections in China that are very corrupt, and he's been corrupt for many, many years, going all the way back but the point I'm making here is it doesn't matter, because if people want to change and they are responding to social currents, they'll put him in. And the same thing might happen in the United Kingdom right now. And maybe the cause of this may be the influence of the pandemic itself. So what is the mood of the British people right now? And is it comparable to what's going on here?
I think there are differences, and let's start with the differences, because Donald Trump hasn't had a particularly good war, let us say. I think the remark about the disinfectant was ill-judged,
Completely taken out of context.
And well, I watched it, and he was thinking on his feet a bit. And it's not the thing you should do when you're in a press conference.
That's how he rolls, as it were.
Yeah, I know. But on this particular occasion, it was deeply unfortunate. Funnily enough, he may be righter than a lot of his own experts realize. There are certain classes of disinfectant which are manufactured in the body, and which, if taken in much larger quantities than the body would normally manufacture them, are very powerful specifics against many, many kinds of infection, including specifically respiratory bacterial infections, which tend to come in opportunistically if you get the Chinese virus, which of course isn't a bacterium, it's a virus, but it lets these opportunistic bacteria in.
Oh, interesting.
And there is a particular class of disinfectants which you can take orally, you don't have to inject them. And you must do it preferably under medical supervision.
Of course.
And that is quite likely to I'm having this investigated in Australia at the moment. That is quite likely to make some sort of a contribution to this. So he wasn't entirely wrong.
Right.
But unfortunately, the way it came across, where it was clear he was thinking on his feet, didn't know what I've just told you, he's now become something of a laughing stock. And of course, the Mark stream media, you look at, in particular, MSNBC, have been running daily personal attacks on him.
Well, they've been doing that since day one. I mean,
and what is interesting is that those attacks, until now, haven't really worked. He's retained, until this pandemic came along, really a very high popularity rating. The edge has come off that now. And this is a big change. Whether it is a sea change or simply a going out of the tide that will come back in again is hard to read at the moment. However, if Mr. Trump wants to recover the position, I think he's going to have to do what Boris Johnson, after a lot of a fatal month of dithering, finally did, which is to lock down the country properly for a few weeks till you've got the growth in the infection under control, and then relax the lockdown in an organized way. And if Trump gets on top of this, I suspect that his ratings will come up again. Boris, you see, is in a different position. We've got just about the highest number of deaths per head of population anywhere in the world. I think Spain is above us. Italy by 2 days' time won't be above us. And I think Belgium is above us. And that's about it. The rest of the world has managed to deal with this virus much more successfully than Boris did, because he was very, very late to take it seriously. And always, if you're dealing with a pandemic, the faster you act, the less you have to do, the less it costs, and the more effective it is. And none of his advisors understood these basic facts of epidemiology, including the epidemiologists, who are still to this day maundering on about R0, the rate at which the virus infects different people. There's no single answer to that question. It's not a useful number when you're in the middle of a pandemic. What you want to know is how quickly it's growing, and then how much you've got to do to interfere with its spread until you've got it under control. And that's a different number altogether. So we were let down very badly, first of all, by China. And Mr. Trump is doing much better than Boris is in pointing out that China is the origin of this virus. It is, in my view, very likely now to have come out from that laboratory in Wuhan. Not, I think, because they were trying to produce a weaponized virus, that is what they did by mistake. but because they were trying to produce a virus that could more easily infect human blood so that they could find vaccines against these classes of virus that come out of bats. I mean, there's one cave in Yunnan province, for instance, where the virus that was the basis for the virus that's now circulating originally came from, in which there are more bats in that one cave, all carrying these hideous viruses, than there are humans on Earth. And so this is a big problem for China. That's why China's been researching.
What a nightmare.
And so they were not confident. What happened was there was a graduate student working at using mild bat blood and urine infected with the Yunnan coronavirus, which is about 95.6% identical to the coronavirus that's now circulating. And the container was breached, and there was supposed to be a detonator on it which would vaporize it if that happened. The detonator failed. She was infected, and I think she was patient 0. She has now been disappeared by the Chinese regime. They say she's all right, but they won't let anyone talk to her. Nobody knows where she is. And her photo and her bio and her doctoral thesis have all disappeared.
Oh my!
The website of the place in Wuhan. Now, Mr. Trump is getting all the material from his intelligence services. He may, if he's really up to date, have also got the latest intelligence, which is that as far back as mid-October, the area around the Wuhan laboratory, for about 2 or 3 miles in all directions, ceased to have any mobile phone traffic at all. Now, what I suspect happened from tying that up to a case report which appeared in one of the medical journals about an outbreak of infection in Wuhan, in that area, in mid-October, is that was when this containment breach occurred. And ever since mid-October, the Chinese Communist Party, and it's the military that runs this laboratory in Wuhan, incidentally, I bet you didn't know that, they've known since mid-October that this virus can transmit from human to human. And they did not admit that until mid-January.
Well, it's even worse than that, in that it's been German intelligence indicates that the WHO conspired with China, colluded with China, if you will, to use an expression popular around here, to hide this fact.
Background of that, the previous director
of the fact that they
was a communist Chinese from Hong Kong. The present director is a communist from Ethiopia.
Yes.
He belonged to a faction in Ethiopia, which is a Marxist front faction, which was and is to this day funded, financed, supported and trained by the communist Chinese regime. And there's a wonderful picture on the web of Tedros Adhanom Ghebreyesus, who is this communist Ethiopian, who has 3 times in the past misreported epidemics in Ethiopia of cholera as simply something that wasn't in fact cholera at all, when he knew perfectly well that it was. He has been taking orders from the Chinese regime, as has Ryan, Michael Ryan, who is the head of emergency programs. He's an Irish communist who I don't know whether you monitored this, but on the 15th of February, which was just about the last meeting to which international statesmen and intelligence operatives went, there was a security conference in Munich. And Ryan went there and, in the presence of the Chinese foreign minister, made the most head-banging speech, saying how wonderfully open and transparent China had been, and how the idea that we shouldn't feel free to travel to and from China was completely unacceptable. There was no reason why we shouldn't do. This was mid-February. The WHO was still saying this.
Well, the thing that bothers me
likewise, is the deputy head of the WHO, Aylward, another communist, has now been removed as deputy head. He's been disappeared from the deputy head section of the WHO's website because he was interviewed by a Taiwanese journalist and made a fearful mess of it, and eventually hung up the phone on her when she asked him why Taiwan couldn't become a full member of the WHO. Taiwan, of course, being the country which has most effectively
handled the Republic of China. That's a political thing.
Absolutely. So we know perfectly well that the WHO has been dancing to China's tune throughout this. They have simply been repeating the lies peddled by the Chinese Communist Party And that is why the international community's decision to invite the WHO to investigate China in this affair is fundamentally misconceived. And so far, of the various statesmen around the world, the only one I've heard saying this properly and loudly and repeatedly is Donald Trump. So, I have a soft spot for Donald Trump. I think he is, by putting America first, putting into perspective the degree to which China has now become a clear and present danger to the rest of the world. And the fact that it infected and infiltrated the WHO and now has it as a wholly controlled subsidiary, as it will shortly do with of all things, the Human Rights Commission of the UN, on which China, the country which least respects human rights in the world, with its harvesting of organs from political prisoners to give to members of the Communist Party, its suppression of Falun Gong, its continuing occupation of Tibet, contrary to all the norms of international law, and now the lying about the virus. China is an extremely dangerous, aggressive country, and only Donald Trump is standing up to it.
Exactly, and I think that one element of it that's particularly troubling is that the WHO actually colluded with China for 2 weeks, I understand, in January to hide this virus. And during that time, you had 3 weeks, and you had flights of people in and out of China and traveling all over the world. That could have cost, the thing could have been contained. I mean, to me, this is probably one of the great crimes the biggest crime since World War II, was since the Cold War.
It is under the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court, to which China isn't a signatory, but before which it can be hailed by countries that are signatories, the crime of extermination, where by act or omission you do something which is calculated to cause widespread loss of life. That is a crime against humanity. And every one of the 7 doctors, plus this graduate student we were talking of earlier from the Wuhan laboratory, who have been disappeared, along with many journalists and other whistleblowers who have been disappeared by the Chinese regime, each one of those disappearances is the crime against humanity of disappearance under the Rome Statute. So what I think should now happen is that China and the WHO should be dragged before the International Criminal Court on charges of conspiracy to commit crimes against humanity. The disappearances are down to China alone, but the extermination, the World Health Organization was a willing, active, and deliberate partner with China in lying to the world, and saps like Boris Johnson, who has never really understood how dangerous communism is. He's of the next generation down from me, so he never really came up against it. He has never understood how dangerous it is. Mm-hmm. And therefore, it's only Donald Trump, who is of the same generation as you and me. He has understood this and is the lone voice at the moment speaking out against this. And you mentioned Biden, and if you want my impression, of course, I haven't examined the patient, but he looks to me as though he is now well into the advanced stages of dementia.
He's very ill, and that's quite clear. And
it's not his fault, but I do not.
I understand. But he doesn't look well. And
under the 25th Amendment to your Constitution, I'm not even sure he should be allowed to stand.
No, everybody knows it, and he's being propped up there, probably pumped up with some kind of serum or something, I don't know, before they crank him up and send him out.
But as you said, his connections with China
are very troubling.
He's not going to call China to account.
No, of course not. But the thing is that to even right now, I should point out that to even discuss the WHO on YouTube could mean that I might disappear because they don't want to criticize the WHO. So I'm just going to mention for the record that if this show disappears and if the station disappears, it's available on a lot of other sites. You could go to my website, charlesmoscowitz.com, and find numerous stations that carry my show in case they do. But the fact is that they are censoring right now any mention of the WHO to show how powerful the Chinese have become and their various appendages and their infiltrations in around the world.
They've infiltrated Google, which owns YouTube,
Exactly.
And they have lent very heavily on Google.
Exactly,
So
which is a subject that I don't
anyone,
want to talk about. I don't want to talk about that because I like doing this show on YouTube, and I'm grateful. I want to talk a little bit
yeah,
going back to the virus itself. It seems to me that in this country, we have, as the old saying goes, flattened the curve. That the infection has not proven so far to be as bad as it was predicted. The WHO and others said we'd see 2 million people dead by April. Now they're saying we'll see 2 million people dead by August. But the fact of the matter is that that hasn't happened so far. So far, there's been 80,000, around 85,000 casualties. The vast majority of whom are over 80 and who are in nursing homes. Others who have been affected are people who have conditions such as they're in poor health. They're obese. They've got blood pressure problems that are undetected. They might have diabetes that's undetected. This has particularly been hard hitting in the minority community, which is not getting the kind of health care they should be getting, which has an aversion oftentimes to going to get health care, probably going all the way back to the days of Margaret Sanger's Negro Project when she was, pushing people into abortion clinics and doing all kinds of things to kind of reduce the what she called a dysgenic race and other progressives. I think there's a tradition of suspicion on the part of African Americans because of that, of going to the doctor and getting medical help. And the
right.
result is that you have people who are more vulnerable to this terrible virus. Now, the point I'm making here is that the vast majority of people who have been infected by the virus, and we're finding out more about that with testing, and that's maybe at most 1% of the population, that it has either it's completely asymptomatic or they have a mild flu-like situation where they stay home for 2 weeks. It is only 1% of those who have been identified as having the virus who end up in the hospital. And of that, there's only a percentage of people who unfortunately pass away. And in this country, they have done a terrible job, at least on the state level, of protecting the elderly and protecting people in nursing homes. And I'll just give one quick example here. The governor of New York, Andrew Cuomo, signed an executive order in, I think it was either February or early March, mandating that hospitals releasing people with active cases of COVID-19 who could not go anywhere else would be sent to nursing homes. Can you imagine that? That's like genocide. I mean, they're putting people in the nursing homes where they're supposed to be protecting people.
Let
And
me
as a result, you have thousands of deaths.
yeah.
Now, here in
Coming on.
my own state of Massachusetts, they don't do that. So there's no excuse. In Massachusetts, we have hotels that the state rents in Greater Boston, where if someone is discharged from a hospital with COVID-19 and they don't have proper lodging, they are sent there where they're taken care of until they get better. So there's no excuse for this. And this is really a large percentage of people who have passed away. Now, the reason I'm bringing this up is because I am wondering, because you mentioned that Donald Trump needs to get on the shutdown. I'm wondering if we haven't passed the curb. I'm wondering because now you have all 50 states to varying degrees are beginning to open up. And I've noticed that there's a political component to this in that the so-called red states, the more conservative states, the more freedom-oriented states, and more conservative people are tending to want to get back to work. They want to get back to normalcy to a certain degree. Obviously, no one wants to catch this disease, so we're protecting ourselves. Whereas you have the more communistic blue states, where that these governors have gotten a taste of the authority that's associated with the virus, and as a result, a shutdown which really probably could have lasted only 2 to 3 weeks, they now want to extend this thing for the rest of the year, and they have these extremely ridiculous and utterly arbitrary and irrational laws. I mean, in New York, for example, you could walk on the beach, but only on the wet part of the beach. You can't walk on the dry sand. Or they've got, in Michigan, you can't buy bird seed in a supermarket, but you can buy liquor and lottery tickets. I mean, they've gone crazy. I mean, it's showing their true nature. Now,
Well,
I don't know how this is going to translate
let me
in
try and
the
help
film.
you out with this,
Yeah,
because I've
please.
spotted your question at the beginning of the 15 minutes you took to ask it.
It's all right. We're both a bit windy here,
And the question you're really asking is, given the fact that if you are under 60, your chance of dying of this is less than if you got flu, is there any need to lock down the under 60s? To which the answer is, not only is there no need to lock down the under 60s, it is time to say to all the under 60s, you can travel about without restriction, save in one respect that I'll come to. Now, the over 60s, however, they need not so much to be locked down by government fiat, but to understand that they are at risk from this virus, and that therefore it is up to them to take sensible precautions to avoid running into situations where they're likely to get it. And that is all the lockdown you need, but you do need that much. You do need to say to the older people, look out for this. It's about 100 times more dangerous for the over 80s, if you get this, than flu is. So that's where you have to be careful. The older you are, the more dangerous it is. If you have diabetes, a third of all the cases in the UK have died because they had diabetes, which is a cofactor for this. And that leads on to another fascinating thing. Practically every public health advice given out by governments is actually controlled by financial vested interests. And the advice that you should eat a high carbohydrate, low fat diet, which was first promoted by communists in the National Institutes of Health in the late 1970s, and has then been copied by communist health agencies around the world ever since. That is the sole and direct and easily demonstrable cause of the epidemic of obesity and diabetes worldwide. And that could be stopped if people did what I did when I was told I got diabetes. I researched it for 3 months, discovered this, found to my fury I'd got diabetes because I'd been following these damn fool government guidelines. And I now eat a high fat diet with steak and pork and all the fat on it and stuff like that. Very little carbohydrate. Bingo, no more diabetes, gone completely, no sign I ever had it. It's absolutely vanished. It's a completely curable condition, provided face down the huge kind of Tate and Lyles and the sugar interests and the bread interests that are trying to promote carbohydrates in the diet. And the same thing applies with the coronavirus. Once one understands the underlying mathematics of it, which is that you have, to talk in terms of set theory, two sets. The under 60s, for whom this is simply a non-issue. Yes, some will die, some will get strange new diseases from it, but very, very, very small numbers, far less than with flu, actually. Whereas the over 60s, they are in a completely different category of risk. That's just the nature of this particular thing. To be fair to governments like that of Donald Trump, and to be fair even to the likes of Cuomo, this was not well understood at the outset. These are things one learns as one goes along. But now that we have learned it, and this is the important thing, now that we know that you're dealing with two different mathematical sets, the under 60s and the over 60s, to whom very, very different mathematics applies, you can and should immediately unlock the world for the under 60s and say, travel about, go to raves, attend 100,000 strong parties. It doesn't matter. You'll all get it. So what? It's not going to do you any harm, most of you. It'd be no worse than flu, less bad than
if
flu.
anything, you build up natural immunity.
Over 60, again, there's no need for an enforced lockdown anymore, because now we know where we're going and we know what the risks are. All that governments now need to do is simply to say to the over 60s, particularly those with the comorbidities you talked about, they must be careful, look to their own interest. And of course, we can no longer discharge patients straight from hospitals into care homes where they're going to give it to everybody else. And that had to be learned. If we'd known that at the start, of course, we wouldn't have done it. We didn't know it at the start. So people all around the world, even the Swedes, made that mistake, and they didn't even lock down at all. Well, they locked down a bit, but not as much as we have. And so when you say we're over the peak, it's not entirely clear to me that we are over the peak. I think in the summer, it's likely to die down a bit. It could come back in the winter. But provided we end the lockdown now for the under 60s, and to the over 60s, we say there will be no compulsory lockdown. But if you get sick, you're going to have to pay for it, because we're not. Then I think you leave it to the responsibility and common sense of the over 60s. You know, I locked myself down here about a month before Boris kind of woke up to the fact that this needed to be done, because I saw it coming. I saw it was dangerous for the elderly, and certainly by the end of February, pretty much one knew that. But some governments in America and in Britain were desperately slow to make that distinction and make sure that the elderly, particularly those who were vulnerable because they didn't control their environment, the people in care homes being the prime example of this, they should have been locked down. And they should have been locked down by the end of February at the very latest, and they weren't. And so that goes back to my original point. You have to lock down early because then it's effective. And now we still have to lock down those who are vulnerable and elderly. But everybody else, those who are elderly but not vulnerable, like you and me, we can get out and do our thing, provided we are common sense and careful about it. And provided we understand that if by going about we catch it, we can't go rushing to the government and saying, oh, it's all your fault. It's our fault if we catch it. And I think that's the approach that should, and indeed, I'm going to put it as strongly as this, must now be taken. Yes, you do have to have an effective lockdown of the vulnerable elderly. For the elderly who are not vulnerable, you tell them they've got to take their own precautions, but that doesn't involve mandatory rules. As far as the under 60s are concerned, open the floodgates, let them have their meetings, let them have their sport, let them go to their raves, let them have their parties on the beach. It doesn't matter, provided they treat us elderly folk with respect by keeping an appropriate and careful distance. And provided they do that, then this thing becomes history more or less overnight. And the economic damage being done by this crazy, universal, non-discriminatory lockdown can be brought to an end, because the economic cost of the communists in the blue states sort of longing to regulate forever is absolutely enormous, and is intended to be so. The Democrats hate prosperity because people who are prosperous vote Republican. They love to create poverty because people who are poor are stupid enough to vote communist.
Well, this is exactly what I was also getting at previous, and that is that because there is a political breakdown in this country where the so-called red states, or those of us who are more conservative or more patriotic, we want to see things get back to normal. We want to protect. That's
a very important distinction.
And whereas the blue state types, they want to run the thing all the way to the election. I think that it was Eric Trump who accurately, he's been attacked for it because he was right. He says they'll run it right up to the election, and then the next day they'll drop it. I've seen that happen in the past with the left. They'll run a scandal, like right up to an election, and then the next day it's gone. But I think that could backfire in a big way, because if the red states do open up and things don't come back the way they thought, things do get back to normal, people start making money, people start going back out, then they're going to prosper, and then people in the blue states are going to have a rebellion. I mean, you're not going to get the hardcore communists. They'll go down with the ship. I mean, but your average liberal.
Georgia on this one, because Georgia has decided to unlock only 3 weeks after locking down. They were last to lock down, and then they thought, sod this for a game of soldiers, we're going to unlock. But if you go onto the governor of Georgia's website, I've not seen a better one anywhere in the world for how well organized it is in saying, if you come in the at-risk categories, you've got to keep yourself separate from everybody else. If you're under 60, you can pretty much do what you like. And, very careful advice is being given, very clear advice is being given. And I've been watching the numbers in Georgia, and there hasn't been this huge surge in cases on the left. would happen, because the governor's thought it through. He's done the maths. He's realized there are two different sets we're dealing with here, the elderly and the young, and he's acted accordingly. And so if Mr. Trump wants to win this election, and I hope he does, because the cost of having some nitwit like Biden in charge would be unendurable. It's really important he should win it. The important thing for him to do now is to work very closely with the Republican governors, learn from them how you can unlock, and then put more and more and more pressure on the blue states and say to them, come on, guys, you're keeping your working people who want to go back to work and earn their living. You're stopping them doing so because you love to do central control, whereas we in the Republican states are letting everybody out again, and we're not seeing vast surges in cases. That's the game I would play, because then the workers who won it for Trump last time, the people like the miners in West Virginia who turned out in enormous numbers for Trump, having previously voted Democrat, these Rust Belt workers who are already rightly suspicious of the Democrats, just as the people in the north of England, the metal bashers of Scunthorpe, all turned out and voted Conservative for the first time in their lives. That's what Trump can build on in the run-up to the election, by saying to the working class, he's got to go right over the heads of the bureaucracy. He's got to speak to the working class and say, in my assessment, if you're under 60 and you're reasonably fit, there is no need for you to be locked down at all. And I am going to press to give you the chance to get your businesses restarted and go back to work and earn some money for your families. I am your champion, you, the working people whom the Democrats want to imprison in their homes. Any excuse. And I think that message will resonate very, very strongly with the working class, just as his message to them did last time, that he was going to bring manufacturing back from places like China. And at last, a lot of the chattering classes are beginning to realize that it's not just a matter of getting the jobs back into the Rust Belt states, it's also the strategic importance of being able to make sufficient quantities of elementary things like gowns and masks and gloves to protect healthcare workers from catching the damn virus from their patients. Now that people understand you have to keep a manufacturing capacity back in the Western countries such as America, and the workers are expecting that Trump will do that, this is a priceless opportunity for him and for Boris Johnson, if he weren't so in hock China, to come out and say, right, we are going to break with China. We're going to bring back our manufacturing from China. This is already beginning to happen anyway, but he can accelerate it and be seen as the agent of it. And the working class throughout America that always voted Democrat in the past and began not to at the last election could yet be brought to come and vote for him in droves, far more even than they did last time. That would be my advice to Mr. Trump if I were advising him on this election. He can win this and win it big. And I wouldn't worry terribly much about the opinion polls at this stage. Hillary Clinton 8 points ahead at this stage.
No, exactly. It's just a little scary.
He continued to be ahead even by the time it got to the Electoral College. But the point was, Trump had gone into these Democrat states and turned them so that even though she got, I think, about 3 million votes more than he did, the way the Electoral College works, he got the victory because he targeted his campaign. It was Steve Bannon who helped him to do that. And
yes. And I think that all of her votes came out of Los Angeles, and it's very suspicious. I actually investigated this a bit in terms of how they do their voting out there, and the vote harvesting, and with registering illegal aliens and all the rest. But I want to get back to I don't know if you know much about this, Christopher, but President Trump has announced a couple of days ago, he made a comment offhandedly that he is taking hydroxychloroquine. Now, my understanding is that this is being used very successfully in Germany, in North Korea, in Brazil, and a couple of other countries where it's being given prophylaxically to people by prescription. And no one should go out and take something like this because it is a drug and it can be dangerous. However, under doctor supervision, people are taking it who are frontline people dealing with this virus. And President Trump has been taking it for several weeks. Do you have any information about hydroxychloroquine?
Yes, I do. As far as dealing with the later stages of the disease are concerned, if you get this badly enough to hospitalize you, it has no effect at all beyond random. That's now been tested for in quite a large study, and it was published 2 days ago, and it demonstrates, not greatly to my surprise, that in the later stages it has no effect.
Okay.
The jury is still out on whether it has a useful prophylactic effect. If you were looking for something which is known to have a prophylactic effect, and as far as I know, virtually no known side effects, then a 25 microgram or 1000 international unit gel tablet of vitamin D3 taken daily will do more to prevent you catching this virus and to minimize its symptoms if you do catch it than anything else. Again, like so many of these medications, if you leave it too late, it isn't so effective, but it has been proven in a very large meta-analysis of clinical trials involving 10,500 people, published in 2017, to be highly efficacious, particularly if you are deficient in vitamin D, as most of us in these northern climes are. And if you're deficient in vitamin D, and you take vitamin D prophylactically, then it will reduce your chance of getting any respiratory infection, by inference, including probably COVID-19, by something like 70%. That's a very big result. Amazing. And that's the one medication that I've seen so far that I myself take, and I've been taking it for years because I discovered this about it some years ago. It's done. I haven't had so much as a cold since I began taking it. I used to get colds every year, not anymore. So that's the one thing that does work. Hydroxychloroquine, suck it and see, but only on prescription. It can cause quite severe atrial fibrillation, which is a fluttering of the heart, which you really don't want. It can kill you in the wrong circumstances. Right. Make sure you ask your doctor first. As for vitamin D, you can buy that over the counter, and provided you don't take more than the dose I've just mentioned, you'll be absolutely fine. There are no known side effects for that. So that's what I'd recommend that. And indeed, that comes back into what you were saying about why people with darker skins are doing less well against this virus. The reason is that vitamin D deficiency, particularly again in these northern climes where the people with darker skins have for various reasons migrated to, their systems have not. It'll take generations of evolution before they adjust to the fact that they have a darker skin in an area where there's not so much sunlight, and therefore sunlight on the skin which makes the vitamin D. We have pale skins. We evolved them millions of years ago when we moved out of Africa because we needed the vitamin D, and the only way to get it was by acquiring paler skins. So darker skinned people, it's particularly important that they should take vitamin D.
Interesting.
In the 25 microgram rather than the 10 microgram dose. If they did that, then my strong suspicion, not yet tested, I'm trying to get it tested at the moment, but not yet tested, so this is only a hypothesis, and I always try to distinguish between what I know and what I don't. My hypothesis is that if vitamin D deficiency were eradicated by this simple daily medication, that's all it takes, eradicate the deficiency in those with darker skins, that will then mean that they will be no more susceptible to death from this virus than we are. That's how it works. There is still one more cofactor. Well, there are two actually. One is they're more prone to diabetes, largely through lifestyle choices, and they're also, of course, some of them are still unfortunately poorer than the average. And there is a rather interesting cultural thing I came across quite by chance the other day, which is that if you are in the United States and you are black, and I'm not making a racial point here, I'm making an observation which appears to be borne out by the statistics, your average cash savings at any one moment, the last time I looked, were $8. Not 8,000, not 80,000, not 8 million, $8. And it seems to me that particularly those, I'm going to call them the sort of busybody groups who go around saying that everything's racialism, that the blacks are permanently disadvantaged. One of the reasons why the blacks are permanently disadvantaged, to my mind, probably the most important reason, is that saving has not yet been internalized as part of their culture, whereas we've been at it for much longer. And I think that what would make the biggest difference to the well-being of people from the ethnic minorities, soon to be majorities in many states, it would be if they could acquire the habit of saving and building up capital. And so I just throw that in as an afterthought, because I think that lack of savings, that lack of the ability to survive when an event like this happens and suddenly you have no wages coming in, that's bound to have an extremely adverse effect, not only on the physical, but also the mental health of those in that financial position. So to my mind, it's rather important that we should encourage the organizations that busy themselves in saying that they're trying to help Black people, Asian people, Middle Eastern people, whatever, that we should start encouraging them to teach capitalism, the word they would use, the word you and I would use is free market economics, how businesses work, how a mortgage, how savings work. These are things that should be taught in schools. Whenever I go into a school and teach, I always do a class on this, so that people who otherwise have never heard how to do a mortgage, how to make savings, how interest works, how shares work, this kind of thing needs to be taught, and it needs in particular to be taught to the Black community, the Asian community, the Middle Eastern community. Middle Eastern ones actually fairly good at it. Asians getting better at it. They've become quite capitalistic in many ways. The Chinese, alas, haven't, but everywhere else has. Singapore is a triumph in that way. Taiwan, likewise. I mean, look at them; they're all doing very well. South Korea, an exception.
Sure, the tigers.
These are the tigers, and they're tigers because they've learnt capitalism and they have internalized it. The ordinary people like it. They're all now like the Levantas. They're all instinctive traders. That's what you want. And my hope for the eventual equalization of society, so that the color of people's skin is simply no longer an interesting subject of conversation at all, is that we need to encourage the folk who are at the moment listening only to the communists, and therefore they only have $8 in their pocket at any given moment. They don't have savings. We've got to say to them, look, come off it. The communists have a direct incentive to keep you poor. Nothing keeps you poor with more sureness than if you never make any savings. And therefore we want to liberate you from the communists, liberate you forever from the Democrats. Once you get people saving, they never vote Democrat again. So it's this kind of thing that I've been quite disappointed that the Republicans haven't really got into this. And the reason for it is a very interesting one. Somebody very perceptive, I forget who, said the other day, the difference between the Republicans and Democrats is that the Democrats love politics and the Republicans hate it. And I think that we, on the centre-right, should start to learn to love politics again and to get into it in such a way that the message of free market economics, where you save and you work and you accumulate and you build your house and you build your family and you look after things and you manage everything properly, that message, if we can get that out, this is what Margaret Thatcher was all about. We were endlessly doing this in Margaret Thatcher's time, and then after her, it all stopped again. But it really got through to people. And the idea of selling, I managed to help with a policy where we sold 1 million of these publicly owned project houses to the people who lived in them on highly favourable terms, both to them and to the state, because the moment we sold them the house, we didn't have to maintain it. They did all that. And so they ended up having a capital stake in society. And the biggest divider between whether you vote communist or whether you vote centre-right is whether you own the roof over your head. And so but in those days, they've forgotten it all now. At this present, they're all clerks now. But we've actually believed this stuff then, and we made sure that people ended up owning their own homes, having their own bank accounts, having their savings accounts, getting shares, getting pensions that they could manage themselves. This had a dramatic effect. And I spoke to the Chileans about this because under the hated Pinochet, they introduced a pension system.
That's right. You had the University of Chicago, they call them the Chicago Boys, headed up by Milton Friedman.
Absolutely.
That literally privatized their Social Security system. And during the same time as Margaret Thatcher,
exactly,
Reagan and Jack Kemp, his his housing and urban development manager, were piloting programs that allowed minorities living in housing projects to own their units after after 1 year of on-time payments. They would then assume their mortgage, and they would assume control and equity. And it was an extremely successful program. President Trump is bringing that back under Secretary Carson, and there's been great strides made. So you're absolutely right in that when people become empowered by a state, by savings, by a stake in the system, they will never fall for communism again. Anyways, Christopher Monckton, I'm kind of reaching toward the end of the program. So, is there anything else that you'd like to bring up? Do you have any websites or books you'd like to mention? Or
well, yes, I do have something which is very important.
Yes.
If you go to whatsupwiththat.com, WATTS, upwiththat.com, and you look for the most recent article by me, it is about Naomi Zeipt, who is a German climate skeptic, aged 19. Look how unusual that is. She is sometimes described as the anti-Greta, though she doesn't like that description. But she is a thinking climate skeptic, very effective.
Wonderful.
And at the moment, German officials are trying to silence her by saying that her videos constitute product placement, which is unlawful in Germany. And they're threatening her with prison simply because she is posting up some perfectly innocuous videos saying that she disagrees with the German party line on the climate question. So it's very I've got an appeal going for her where you donate directly to her Patreon account. And if you go to WATTS upwiththat.com, find my article, there are links at the beginning and end of that article to her Patreon account if you're willing to give sort of $10, $25 a month to keep her going, because her income has been destroyed by this action.
Oh my God, really?
And likewise, there's also a link to a PayPal account where you can make a one-off if you'd rather do it that way. But if you could make sure that these links, you pick this up yourself from What's Up With That, put these links on your website.
Will do.
And advise people to make sure that they donate to Naomi. She's a slip of a thing. She's very young. She's seen through the climate garbage. I met her at the European Conference on Climate in December last year, organized by the European Climate and Energy Foundation. She spoke there most brilliantly. I spoke too, less brilliantly. And she, won the hearts of a lot of us there. She's very, very good because she can reach the younger folk. Her own, she's millennial, she can reach the millennials. And so
I'd love to have her on this show.
Do, by all means.
If you can drop me a note.
Coordinates, yeah.
And I'd love to, and maybe we could even get into debate Greta. I don't think that anytime soon.
Greta will be like Al Gore with me. We ran ads for 6 months daily in 2007, in which I offered to debate Al Gore on the climate anywhere on any terms that he liked. We never received fire. They know that the moment they debate this,
they can't win.
Because they know that what they're saying is rubbish, but nevertheless, that's how they've managed to do it. And because the mainstream media gives them an easy time, they get away with it. But the climate thing is going to become big again because people are beginning to realize that things like the Energiewende in Germany, this expensive program of wind farms and solar panels that's trashing the countryside and producing unreliable electricity at 8 times the previous price, that this sort of thing can no longer be afforded now that we've shot our economies in the foot by responding late and insufficiently cleverly to this COVID thing. And what we've now got to do, and I want to end on this, is to say that it is necessary for governments now to unlock straight away for the under 60s and to unlock for the over 60s, subject to advising them that they need to take precautions which the young people, frankly, don't any longer need to take.
Very, very good. Excellent note to leave my audience with. Christopher Monckton, thank you so much for joining me, Viscount of Brenchley. We should talk soon. And as always, I appreciate you joining me.
It's a pleasure.
Thank you, Christopher.
God bless America. God bless Canada. God bless all the English-speaking peoples. We have much to offer the world just at the moment.
Thank you. And I'll send you a link once it's up on YouTube.